Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here with us for our first webinar series from Sunwest Communications. My name is Crayton Webb. I'm the owner and CEO of Sunwest. And what we had hoped to do was really look ahead today. I hope you all are well and healthy and sheltering in place and staying sane. We've got folks from all over the country who've joined us, as well as all over the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And we've got a fantastic panel of guests today, three of which are my team members from Sunwest Communications: Whitney Strauss, Melissa Cameron, and Lauren Duggar. But we're also joined by a very special guest, Jane Randel, who's joined us from New York City, or from just outside of New York. I'll introduce Jane here momentarily. She's got a fantastic background. She is the co-founder of Karp, Randel, a social impact consultant organization, is the former head of corporate communications and corporate social responsibility for Kate Spade, which was formerly Liz Claiborne, and is also the co-founder of a national organization by the name of No More, which is focused on ending domestic violence and sexual assault and working to be the pink ribbon, if you will, in the effort to end and prevent domestic violence. What we're hoping to do today is have a really robust dialogue, and of course at the end take your questions here via the chat function. About philanthropy, we've got a number of folks joining us from the philanthropic and nonprofit community, as well as others from the corporate side who are representing corporate social responsibility or community affairs departments. And really an interesting time, to say the least. Of course, for nonprofit organizations, either they've been on the front line and have had to step up in a way that they hadn't imagined, or are not perhaps on the front line and have had some tremendous funding repercussions because of COVID-19. And the same is true for our colleagues in the CSR space on the corporate side, some tough decisions to make. So we're gonna have a series of questions. We'll go to each of our panelists, but let's start, Jane, with you, if you would. And I'm curious, you, both with your clients at Karp Randel, as well as your work with No More, are seeing both the corporate side as well as the nonprofit side right now. Mm-hmm. How would you describe the state of philanthropy, if you will? Is this like 9/11? Is it 2008? Is it like nothing we've ever seen before? How would you describe it?
Well, first, thank you, Crayton, for having me and for having me with all your colleagues who are, when I read their bios, I'm more than impressed. So thank you very much. You know, we are in uncharted waters, and while I can see the temptation to compare to 9/11 and 2008, you know, 9/11 was one event that it took a while to recover from, but it was a discrete period of time. 2008 was different, obviously. What is so different in 2020, just generally, and this is not news to anybody, is that we are all in the same place. In other words, everybody is sort of dealing at once with the same issue globally. So they're not, it's definitely not the same. I mean, the world fell off a cliff, basically, in about a minute and a half. So I think for me, what I see certainly in the corporate space is that everyone is looking to sort of know what to do, what's the right thing to do, how should we be spending our money, should it be philanthropic, should it be marketing? Most bigger companies just sort of went out of the gate with the relief work that needed to happen. But I think that for me, I believe it's a little bit too early to sort of give it a name in terms of the full state. You know, we're still sort of in the middle of it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Next, I want to turn to my colleague, Melissa Cameron. Melissa is Senior Counsel of Corporate Social Responsibility and Philanthropic Services here at Sunwest. A distinguished past, formerly Chief Development Officer for Dallas Area Habitat for Humanity, where she led the way on a $100 million capital campaign. And then from there was the Executive Director of the largest or the near largest affiliate of the American Heart Association, also here in the DFW area. Melissa, what are you seeing? What's your assessment of the situation, both from the corporate and the nonprofit side, based on your clients and conversations?
Yeah, thanks, Crayton. And I love what Jane had to say. It's hard to put a name on it right now. We're still flying off that cliff. And I think that it's similar in some sense in that the response has been incredible globally. It's different in the sense that we're still in the middle of the free fall. I think that we're seeing that this crisis is somewhat of a stress test for CSR programs, right? Are they fully formed? Are they a representation of a company's moral compass? Are they just purely reactionary? And are they more PR than substance? I think we've seen those examples. And I think in terms of philanthropy, we're seeing an incredible lift in generosity. You've got foundations that are continuing down the path of their critical work with their partners, but then you're also seeing a lot of coming together to brainstorm and come up with ideas to provide additional resources, the emergency funding, in order to meet immediate needs. I think that this is a time for reinvention, reevaluation. What is the delivery and the impact of the services on the philanthropic side? I mean, I think that at the end of the day, we're all going to be looking back, because I certainly remember 9/11 and asking, what did we do during this time? And we're all going to be having these conversations, whether it's 2 years from now or a decade from now. How did you respond?
Yeah, fair enough, Melissa. Thank you very much. Before I introduce our next panelist, let me just mention that we're also on Facebook Live right now. So if you missed part of the conversation or want to go back and watch it again, you can do that on Facebook or also on our website at sunwestpr.com. Sunwestpr.com is also a great source to look up and look through the bios of our individual panelists. Our next is Lauren Duggar, a 20-year veteran of Sunwest Communications, and she's the Senior Managing Director of our Corporate Social Responsibility and Philanthropic Services portfolio and area. Lauren, you have a number of nonprofit clients, some of whom are on the front line, some are not. And you also have some for-profit foundations, corporate foundations and corporations that are really engaged in corporate social responsibility. How would you assess the situation based on what you're seeing and hearing from them?
I think it's like Jane and Melissa said, we are in the middle, we're in the thick of it, and a lot of people have moved forward with an initial response that's been positive, but are a little concerned about what the long-term plans are and are having some trouble determining what they're going to do long-term. Philanthropy, in terms of nonprofits, many have laid off folks, furloughed folks, some are going to unfortunately shut down. But a lot of them are collaborating and figuring out what they can do to provide services and meet their mission at the same time. We are going to need all of these nonprofits in the future. As long as we have COVID-19, we're going to have increasing needs, but we're also going to have those needs that have always been there. And the nonprofits, if we're not supporting them, if they're falling off the track, we're losing that safety net that our communities have. And so I think corporations, understand that and want to step up and help. But unfortunately, today's news, unemployment is worse than the Great Depression, and people are having to consider layoffs and profit issues. And so a lot of them have redirected funds that they originally assigned to another nonprofit to help in this COVID-19 fight, which is helpful, but not particularly helpful to the nonprofit. So what we're trying to tell people is focus on what your plan has been, what your commitments have been. Get creative and see how else you could support programs that you without funds, if it's volunteers, materials, that sort of thing, and just be transparent through all of this, because people need to know what you're doing. You don't want to be bragging or using it as a marketing ploy, but employees, your board, your constituents, everyone needs to know what's happening. So you need to be transparent, even if the news is not the greatest.
Lauren, your comments, notwithstanding those made by our panelists a moment ago about how this is different than anything we've ever seen before, couldn't agree more. What's reminiscent, of course, is right after 9/11, so many nonprofits that weren't on the front line were struggling and were saying, hey, don't forget the home front. These needs still exist after this crisis passes. Our next panelist has a Very impressive bio. She has been a nonprofit executive director. She's been a consultant and helped corporations start their own 501c3s. She's an outsourced executive director for nonprofit organizations and corporate foundations now. She's getting her doctorate in social impact and is an author of children's books. But all very impressive. Whitney Strauss, let me turn to you and just begin with your big picture analysis of what you're seeing and hearing right now.
Well, thank you, Crayton, and thank you to Jane and Lauren and Melissa. I'm just really honored to be a part of this panel and be able to talk about this important topic. I think just highlighting what's already been said and adding to that, I think this is going to be a game changer for CSR and for foundations and for nonprofits moving forward. It's completely changing the conversation. As Lauren said, with the transparency, there's also a need for authenticity as well, and talking about our core competencies and doubling down on partnerships and collaborations, and really talking about not only how are we responding now, but how are we going to continue to help each other in the long run. In the CSR community, I think with how businesses are responding, they put a lot of measures in place to support employees and support their nonprofit partners. And I think the term business, going back to business as usual, is just not the case. I don't think that's going to happen. And I think in many ways that's a good thing, because a lot of businesses have put forth efforts for, mental health awareness with their employees, or different health and wellness initiatives, or just kind of utilizing their core competencies differently. And I think optic-wise, I don't think that's going to go away, and I don't think it should go away. And then also how they're talking to their nonprofit partners has changed considerably, because it's kind of wheels off with this. We can really be honest and candid about what are the needs, where are the gaps, what are we learning from this with our systems, and where are the weaknesses in terms of, one thing that's come up with the nonprofit community in Dallas, and I'm also seeing this nationally, is there is the digital divide, and there's a communications issue with reaching out to primarily Hispanic speaking families. That this has completely changed the game. And that was a weakness before, but this has really highlighted it. And then how our community is going to address those kinds of gaps moving forward.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm intrigued, probably like all of you who are joining us. And again, thanks to all of you who've joined us. We've got folks here in the Dallas-Fort Worth region, as well as Washington, D.C., some in New York, some on the West Coast also. So thank you for joining us here. Again, for those of you who've just dialed in, this is Sunwest Communications webinar on looking ahead at philanthropy and corporate social responsibility post-COVID-19. Jane, I want to go back to you. It seems to me, with all the emails we're getting from, it feels like the sharks are circling and the piranhas are biting at our ankles, buy from me, come buy our service, we're helping, we can get you to survive. It seems like it's really dangerous territory, if you will, for corporations right now to determine how do they talk about their efforts to give back in an appropriate way. As my old CEO used to say, if we're not making any money, we can't give any money away. So of course they want to share their story, but what are the troubled waters? What advice are you giving? And what red flags do you see? Oh, Jane, you're on mute.
Darn, I'm the one. I was literally having this conversation with some colleagues a few hours ago. I think people do want to know what corporations are doing. The words transparent, authentic, all of that is true. You have to make sure you're not selling. You're not telling people what you're doing to try and sell a product. I did see one company do that early on, or what felt like that early on, and I was kind of grossed out. I also think that really dangerous waters are not taking care of your employees. People want to see that companies are stepping up and taking care of their employee base. That's actually one of the most important things. And so threading the needle, and I'm not sure I have an answer because it's very hard, but threading the needle is, how do you be philanthropic when you're furloughing, a third of your staff, or laying off a third of your staff, right? So you want to help, you want to give back, but now you've cut your employee base significantly. And so, there's different ways to do that, but these are all, there is no playbook here. This is all, people are running on, pure gut and instinct and talking to figure out what makes the most sense. I do believe that one thing that's really dangerous is to do nothing.
Yeah.
I think corporations have to do something, and their first priority should be their employees.
At the risk of asking you to advertise for anyone in particular, your involvement with No More, I recently saw that No More did launch with a corporate partner a cause-related marketing program. Will you tell us a little bit about that, and how did No More, the nonprofit organization you co-founded, how did you advise them to thread the needle, and do you think they were successful?
It just launched, so it's hard to say. It sort of was launching as things were going downhill. The campaign called Isolated Not Alone is very similar to one that we were doing here called Listening from Home, because with everyone with the stay-at-home orders in place, domestic violence reports of domestic violence, as you know, Crayton, have increased very, very much on the local basis, either to police offices or to local organizations. And so the idea for all of these is for people to be aware of this. And now that we're all home, sort of watching out for each other. The Body Shop has been engaged in and the other companies owned by the same organization. Sorry, there's a truck outside. Including Avon, they've been engaged in these issues around domestic violence for a very long time. And they had this campaign, and they realized No More, not to correct you, but No More is actually an international organization. And so they realized the power and the breadth of the brand, and really came to us to figure out how best to get these messages out. Because as everyone was saying, it's not like everything else stops, right? It's not like COVID, you have COVID and all the other needs go away. You're hearing all these reports from doctors' offices, right? People aren't getting their usual, even people with pre-existing conditions are not taking care of themselves in the same way. They're not going to see the doctor because they're afraid. But it's not like any of that stops. And so it's an interesting ride, and I give them credit. And it's a good investment for the long run.
Melissa Cameron, what advice are you giving your nonprofit clients who are being approached by corporations, and corporations who want to engage, so that they're really threading that needle of messaging and not appearing like they're self-serving? How do they do it?
Yeah, I think, Crayton, we've said it before. I think Whitney may have said the word genuine, organic, authentic. I mean, I keep hearkening back to, we have to start with the why. I know we've heard it enough. Thank you, Simon Sinek. But it's the truth. I mean, a good program and jumping into the deep end without asking yourself, why are we doing this? And what are our core values? And if we haven't defined our core values, we need to define our core values. I think that's one way of approaching this in a very heartfelt and genuine manner, because our employees will see it. Certainly the consumers will see it, and that builds that goodwill and reputation in the long term. I think that companies have to ask themselves, what do we bring as a company to help be part of solving community and social issues that's unique to us? Do we have products and services that are relevant if we're not already engaging? And I love Jane's example, because that seems so blessedly organic. But if we can physically engage, that's great, and financially great if we have the resources to do that. But if we don't, how are we part of a conversation and utilize all of our resources and our outreach to be able to be part of the conversation that is communicating altruism, doing the right thing, and is hopeful? So at the end of the day, we need to be genuine and reflective of our company values, not self-serving. That is so, we think it's self-evident, but it's something you have to ask yourself. Of course, starting with the why helps. And then for the nonprofits, It's being able to connect with those you're already working with to be able to say, here's a need. And it may not be sexy, but gee, we need technology. We need just someone to pick up the phone or be part of a webinar to connect with our clients. And that's a great way for companies and the nonprofits to partner together. How do you offer your services to the clients of an organization that can be value to those clients and help them be self-sustaining and sustained through the crisis?
Lauren Duggar, same question to you. How are you advising your corporate clients on how to engage and what to steer away from, frankly?
Well, definitely engaging with the partners you already have and keeping open communication with them. But what I'm seeing in Dallas is a lot of great collaboration and conversation between business leaders and business owners. And I think that's important so everyone is not going off and doing a one-off, that there is some cohesion and that we understand where the gaps are, and the company can determine, this is a gap that I can help in, this is a gap that our company can help in. But of course, the priorities, as Jim mentioned, employees number one, business continuity, and then you move on to supporting the community. People need to know that you are, if you have to have layoffs, that people need to know that maybe you're keeping up with their health insurance, you're providing employee assistance. People need to know that, if you are working on, you are strong, you are moving forward in this time, you still have a wonderful business plan for the future. And then you can get into where you can help in the community. Another topic that is very important is not determining in a silo what you're going to do. Engaging in the communities in which you want to help, not just plopping down a program or decision or funds for what you think they need, but asking the people who know the community, who are in the community. We've seen so much disparity between how this is affecting low-income neighborhoods, people of color, and that sort of thing. So not assuming that you have all the answers, but engaging in those conversations with your colleagues and with the communities you're serving to ensure that you're providing the most help possible.
Whitney Strauss.
Well, I love how Lauren ended that, because I just wrote a paper about that. Being intentional with your altruism and really helping people in ways that are truly helpful. And a lot of that is, I think for my corporate clients, it's asking them to do it twofold. Really understand what their core competencies are and stick with that. Take care of your employees and your stakeholders, because in this environment, you don't want to be that business that didn't step up or wasn't transparent or wasn't impact driven with what you were trying to do and taking care of your partners and your employees with your core values and core competencies, remembering who you are and taking that forward. And then for the nonprofit sector, I think, as Lauren said, those disparities have been there for a very long time, and this situation is exacerbating that. So it is, asking those questions on what do you need? How can we be helpful? Here are our core competencies. Could that be helpful to you at this time? And it doesn't necessarily need to be funding, which that's always important. It could be, as I said earlier, the communications is a big issue. Or, we're having supply chain issues now. How are you all being innovative about that? A great quote that I heard this past week from the United Way was, "This is fertile ground for innovation." So that's how I am encouraging my clients right now as they're working through it, is to, always keeping in mind their core competencies and being authentic, but, as Lauren said, doing things that in ways that are truly helpful and not making decisions in a silo.
I want to remind the audience that's joining us that there's an opportunity for you to ask questions here in about 15 minutes. So if you have a question for one of our panelists, be sure to use the chat feature and type your question in. And Hannah Luera from the Sunwest team will read that question here when the time is right. Also want to remind you that the bios of our panelists are at sunwestpr.com, and as well as the playback of this particular webinar. If you missed the first portion or would like to watch it again, it'll be available to you. Lots of fundraisers on the phone, Jane, not surprisingly. I'm interested in not just what advice you're giving to your nonprofit clients, but how do you segregate the advice? There are folks who are on the front line, whether they're with food banks or the hospital systems. They're supporting childcare for healthcare workers. And then others who are representing arts organizations or sustainability organizations, the National Arbor Day Foundation, for example, and that does tree planting. How do you give and differentiate in your advice between the two on what they should be doing?
Well, this one's going to be a little, I was like, am I muted? This one's going to be a little different because I generally advise more corporate clients. So it's a bit easier for me to answer it from that side because there is the same, it does work two ways, right? If you're a corporation who gives to the arts or it gives to STEM, so you can't quite see how this, how to engage in this issue, there are ways to find the right nonprofit partners and do it quickly and still stay within your frame. Again, I can go back to No More where I have, sort of firsthand experience. Domestic violence is an unintended consequence, but it's not the top story, right? It's not a need for food. It's not PPE. It's not, all the things that we knew immediately had to happen. And, for No More, we sort of, I think you have to find your opportunities. I think it's unfortunate. I think you should go back to your bigger donors. And we've had a bunch of people come forward for this other fund that I'm on and ask for emergency grants for general operating. But I think you have to, for us, we had to find our time and figure out how to be part of this. So one example is, I don't know if anybody's seen it, it's fabulous if you haven't, but Juilliard, everyone's doing these pieced together videos. Juilliard did an unbelievable one that included, some of their most famous graduates, Laura Linney, Jean-Baptiste from the Colbert Show, lots of different people, and then just students. And look, that's a great way for Juilliard to stay top of mind without necessarily putting their hand out. And I think you've seen Philharmonic orchestras do that. You've seen Broadway shows do that. And I think that is we're lucky in these times that they have this kind of technology that can still bring people together around the arts, for example. But I am sure that your colleagues are going to be able to give a far better answer to this one.
Well, you, as usual, you're humble. It really reminds me, Melissa Cameron, of 9/11 and when the United Way, both in Dallas and in other communities, after the primary and the secondary stories passed, it was appropriate to launch a Homefront coalition,
Right.
To remind folks at home, hey, after you've finished giving in New York and Washington, don't forget the Homefront and all of the many organizations that need you here. Is it, in this instance, is it the same? And how are you advising your clients in the two different areas?
I don't know if it's the same. I've been advising communicate. Stop. Communicate with, as Jane said, to those that have been supporting you. You've got to first ask them how are they doing. We have uber wealthy people who are not able to reach in and have liquid capital, depending on what their certain situation is. But how are you doing? And then here's how we're doing. Arts organization or even frontline funders of frontline organizations. Here's how we're responding. Here's how we're pivoting. Here's how we're providing. We have a client who had to switch from face-to-face coaching to online coaching. Had to go from in-home nurse visits to telehealth. And wow, we realized through that pivot that we have a woeful lack of technology support, and we need funding for that. And that's a whole new case for support, right? So I think that communication is key. And then for arts organizations, I think that Jane is a great point. You know, you go online and you provide the wonderful show, and it's done virtually. We've seen here the Texas Ballet providing classes and opportunities to engage and watch virtual tours of museums and art galleries. So they're communicating and also staying relevant by keeping the word out about their organization.
Great points. Lauren, then Whitney.
Again, communication is key, and I think a lot of nonprofits, even if they aren't frontline, can find a niche of their services and highlight that. For example, we work with Texas Trees Foundation. You mentioned Arbor Foundation. There's still a need to plant trees, and they are still planting trees. And there's going to be a need, and there's so much research about how we need these trees for our health, and everyone being stuck outside, we need to get outside and enjoy these trees. So some of the communications they're putting out is helpful in terms of, you know, what we need to do to take care of ourselves, and that this is still important. They are planning for the long term, but there are very relevant things that they can be putting out right now. They put together a scavenger hunt for kids, you know, to go out in nature and do something productive and educational. So figuring out what is currently really relevant, and then going back to your big donors, going back to the people who have supported you long-term, telling them the situation, giving them, you know, transparency, and having the conversation. What are your plans? What are you looking at? What do you think? Because as we pivot and are nimble, we need to have those conversations in place, and we need to be having them now. So nonprofits don't get left aside. One positive thing that I'm seeing, and that some of the nonprofits I'm working with are seeing, are that people are still giving to nonprofits that, I mean, people of course are giving more to the nonprofits that are COVID-19 frontline, but North Texas Giving Day, thousands of organizations received funding that aren't frontline. We work at the Catholic Foundation, and a lot of their grants that are going out are for the basic needs that they've always been providing grants for. So I think there is a steadfast stream of that support that will continue, but it's just a matter of communicating that, keeping yourself in front of your donors and new audiences at the same time.
Whitney, jump in.
I thought that all of that was so well said by everybody. I think I just wanted to add, just in this case, I think there is some concern on, you know, how is the best way to move forward with fundraising when all of this is going on. And I think, you know, this is a storm that everybody's facing, but we are all in different boats. So I think taking what Melissa and Lauren and Jane said, it is just continuing to communicate. And, you know, fundraising is relational. So it's person to person, and checking in on folks and how are you doing, and being really candid about, you know, this is what we're facing now, but these are our concerns moving forward. And then, you know, as I said before, this is fertile ground for innovation and really looking at partnerships really differently and being candid about those needs. And, you know, whether businesses and individuals are still asking, how can we help? So I think the more we communicate and the more that we're really candid about that, the better in meeting those needs. And since the situation is such a game changer, I think it presents the opportunity that everyone can be a philanthropist in some way.
Whitney, that is a great transition into the first participant question we have that I'm going to launch here to the panel. Here's the question: how can nonprofits best reach out to corporate partners to see if assistance is available while recognizing that corporations are also hurting? How should they provide the best customer service to our corporate partners? Whitney, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I have been on the CSR side before, going through a difficult economic time. And so I looked to my nonprofit partners to tell me, you know, what is going on? What are you all seeing on the front lines that, you know, I may not be aware of? And a lot of the times, although we may have to cut back on our funding budgets and things like that, there may be some other ways that we could be helpful. So I think just keeping it open to being really transparent and innovative with different approaches on partnership, I think is key. And, you know, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to have that conversation.
Oh,
Who wants to jump in? Not everybody at once.
I can jump in. You know, I think that you know, I'm not sure if you're asking if it's a partner, if it's a corporation you've had a relationship with, or it's somebody that you're reaching out to as a cold call. Because if it's a cold call, that is, you know, that's the age-old question. You know, how do you get into a company? Because every issue is important. I think that one way, assuming the nonprofit has the capacity to do it, is sort of the reciprocal of what I'm sorry, I can't remember which person said it, about offering you know, services. What can you do, nonprofit, for companies' employee base? It's not necessarily an immediate grant, but it's a little bit of a long game if you have the capacity to do that. You know, this is an age-old question. It's very hard to get into companies. It's why you're seeing many more more strict parameters around CSR. I mean, one of the reasons why people are being much more focused, because it helps them avoid mission creep, the companies. But I think that it's look, you have nothing to lose in asking and offering, to see how you can support the business, especially maybe if it's a local business and smaller, and you can offer something for families or for employees in the workplace or not.
So do you mean, Jane, like if you're the American Red Cross or another nonprofit that does a blood drive,
Yeah.
and as employees come back to work, hey, we're all thinking about your employees are asking how they can you can activate them. Is that what you mean?
That, yes. And maybe if it's a small arts organization, just to go back to that, maybe they create something that's special, depending on what they do, just for that employee base, or just for the kids of that. Maybe they offer some hour of entertainment for the kids of the employees who have to do homeschooling. I'm making this up, honestly, because as I said before, there is no playbook. I think it's a matter of really trying to get in front of people and show what you do and the need.
Jane, while you're on screen, I do want to ask you, and this may be difficult for you to assess because you live on the East Coast, so your world is your world. But there's a lot of folks who've joined us, notwithstanding those from Washington, D.C. and New York and the West Coast. There's a lot here in the central part and Texas, frankly, who are on our webinar today. Do you think that the response is different regionally? And because New York has felt this pandemic in a way really that no other community has, are there differences in the way corporations are giving and responding and in the way nonprofits are asking?
Sure. I mean, there have to be. I mean, if you think about, look at Microsoft, one of the first things it did was give money right in the Seattle area, right around the area that was most impacted and where they live and work. Yeah, of course. I think there's always going to be regional differences because people respond differently. You know, New York is, it was hard, you know, for a long time. I don't live in New York, but the news out of New York was so awful all the time. And so overwhelming that it was easy to see why people were trying to, you know, send as much PPE there and do whatever they can. But one of our clients, like many others, created, you know, the shields. They did 3D printing. They're a tech company, created shields, and they're based in Pennsylvania and a few other places, and they made sure it got to their local communities. Corporations always feel a big need to, and appropriately so, to give where they work and live, where their employees work and live. It's important for any company to have good standing there. So yeah, I think everybody is going to react a little differently. You know, when you see wildfires in California, Western companies may react differently than Eastern companies, but it's not for lack of caring, and it's just it's a different approach and a different way of looking at things.
Lauren Duggar, let me turn to you with a question that has come from one of our participants. You are the events guru, and the gala events that you have led and put on over the years are impressive. But our participant is asking, what ideas do you have about virtual events? And their comment is, I think people are getting a little tired of them. What about events in the fall? What's your prediction? What do you see? What are best practices, Lauren?
Well, as we're moving forward, the most important thing is to be creative and innovative, and also, to be honest, just some down to the nitty gritty. The clients we're working with who are planning events for the fall, or even at the beginning of 2021, you have to be really careful with your contracts, the vendors, your entertainer, anything that you are paying out of pocket for, because again, this happened. No one had any idea that it was going to impact us the way it did, and you need to protect yourselves with some new kind of contracts and have lawyers look over that so you don't get burned in the end. There's local nonprofits in Dallas who are continuing to have postponed their events and are going for them in the fall. Some people have just canceled them for the year and restart again in 2021. People have been very, very creative in the virtual events, and I think if you have one of those, it needs to stand out, because people are getting tired of just going and hearing someone speak and maybe hearing it needs to be something innovative that will draw folks in. For an example, there's a organization I work with that does breast cancer research funding and support for breast cancer survivors, and they have a drumathon each year that takes place in Dallas. They were kind of outgrowing their space anyway, so they're doing a virtual event in October. They're still going to be able to do auctions online. But they're going to be able to open their audience to more than just people in Dallas. They have celebrity drummers that come every year. Now they'll be able to have more of them because we don't have to get them in a physical place on a certain date. So they're using that as an opportunity to, something that they were thinking about before all this is how do we grow, how do we reach out more, and having some fun and creative ways to do that will engage people. But you have to think about the typical events of the past, the 1,000-person gala. People might not be comfortable doing that, even when authorities say that we can. So coming up with different ways to have smaller events, more personalized events, and also continuing to offer live streaming and that sort of thing so people can be involved even if they can't physically attend.
Lauren, thanks. Melissa, Cameron, this next question from one of our participants is for you. I think you were talking about pivoting. A shout out to Bike the Blue, which is, our participant says, an organization, a nonprofit that's less than a year old. She says, our first fundraiser was to be April, May, and June. We raised funding for bike patrol units for all of Tarrant County, which for those of you who don't live in the DFW area is Fort Worth. Asking for bike funding just doesn't seem appropriate during this pandemic, she says. We're refocused temporarily and gave funding to Fort Worth officers for meals and fire departments for groceries. But how and when do we get back to our mission focused of asking people for bike funding again? What say you?
Right. I think that the gracious pause is appropriate, but as we said earlier in the program, having conversations with those who are supporters of law enforcement and not just that frontline emergency services, but the actual work that our officers do sometimes requires a bike. And so I think sharing that message, some of the most effective policing is frankly on a bicycle and not in a car. So I can definitely see, while you've taken the appropriate pause, I think you've got to re-engage your funders and those that are friends of the organization and say, we still need help, and this is why. Are we seeing an increase in Tarrant County in certain pockets that we've normally patrolled via bikes? Do we already have a campaign in place where we're just shy of our goal? I don't know what your current circumstance is, Stephanie, but I think that you have a case for support that is still a great need, and to be able to communicate that to your funders, and even in light of what's happening, that communication still needs to happen.
Yeah, any other panelists, raise your hand if you want to take a crack at that. If not, we'll keep going. Okay, so Whitney, let's take the opposite approach. We've worked with an organization here called Carson's Village that helps families bereaving from an unexpected death. Their phone has been ringing off the hook, just like, I imagine, food banks around the country. How do you advise nonprofits that weren't ready for the firestorm and are now seeing huge demand, but with it, perhaps huge resources too? And how do they make sure, if I might further the question, that this is not just a huge blip on the screen, and then when things do somewhat return to normal, how do they sustain their growth?
That is a good question.
I mean,
that there's a lot to be said with that. I have done a lot of work with the North Texas Food Bank and with Feeding America. I was actually in a conversation with them this week about that. And, we work with Carson's Village. So I think it is two things that I have seen and would recommend is one, partnerships and collaborations to manage that load. I know locally, the North Texas Food Bank has been really innovative with some of the work that they've done to continue operations and serve that increased need. So that would be one thing that I've noticed that I would recommend is, looking at not only their own capacity, but also leveraging partnerships and collaborations to make sure that they're meeting this huge increase of need that's coming on, not knowing when it may end. The other thing that I would recommend is, for lack of a better word, it's kind of leveraging this time and how they're responding, to really talk about their organization and their mission long term, because I think that there's a lot of PR and a lot of news that's coming out about organizations like Carson's Village and their mission. So I think it's important that they are continuing to put out how they are helpful now and in the long term, because I think that's something that they can continue to leverage.
Yeah, great. Jane, let's start with you, and then go through all of our panelists, and then we've got at least another one additional participant question that I'd like to try to make time for. What does corporate social responsibility and philanthropy look like after COVID-19? I mean, we've all said our world will never be the same. What exactly does that mean as it relates to these two particular areas?
Good question. I think that you will see companies more engaged, even those who have not been engaged. You mean this is down the road, even those who have not been particularly engaged, because they will see the value for their own employee base, which, as we know, demands companies to be more engaged, but also for their corporate reputation. The company that I mentioned that created the shields, it's a B2B company. This is not a consumer company that anyone's going to know, but they did it because it was the right thing to do and they saw a lot of suffering. I think that we don't know what post-COVID world is going to look like. The needs coming out of this after the initial emergency ends, I think are going to be quite great. And I think that more companies are going to engage, and they're going to look for issues certainly that meet their purpose because they need to, but also to see how, again, they can do things that resonate with their employees, with their consumers, that are authentic, transparent, and all those words. The one scary thing that I'm just going to point out, and the other panelists can weigh in, there's a proverbial second wave coming. So I think a good question or something good to remind certainly corporations and nonprofits is, sort of don't do it all now, because there's another wave coming that, if everyone depletes everything they have, and certainly will be better prepared, but it's unclear, if everything they're saying and the timing and the flu it's true, there's more troubled waters ahead, which is exactly what Melissa was saying. There's a lot coming, and I think corporations need to be aware of that as well.
A great pivot to another participant question. This one is from Kate Rose Marquez from Wings here in Dallas. Can you, Jane, and we'll start with you, talk a little bit about when do you anticipate the timing and tone will change from response to recovery? And I think that's a particularly interesting question, considering what you just said about is it possible that we'll move into recovery mode, particularly as states begin to reopen, and then go back to response? How do you see it playing out?
I definitely think that. I think, more and more companies are starting to talk about, not big companies, about how to go back to work, how to get people back into the office if they want to. There's a lot more sense of, there's a lot more sensitivity around people and whether or not they're going to be too afraid and this and that. And so I think you're starting to see a little bit of a creep, but Crayton, it goes back to the question you asked regionally, because this is moving across the country, right? So New York got hit hard and got hit first, but it's still moving. And so I think that hinders the timeline of sort of going into recovery, because you may be in a state that is, COVID free, but 2 states over, they're in the middle of a big outbreak. But again, look, the NFL announced their their season schedule. NASCAR is starting to race again.
Yeah, this weekend. Weekend.
And so you are starting to see that come back, because people are craving some sort of normal, even though we all know there's a new normal and it will never be the same, or not for a long time, but people are craving some normal. And I think that's where you're starting to see some of at least marketing go, understanding and embracing the new normal.
Anyone else on the panel, raise your hand if you want to take a crack at that. Okay, Melissa? No, okay, raising your hand to say no. I think, okay, with the time that we've got left, I think we've got one more question from a participant, and let me address it to all of you. And I think it's very interesting, and it hits both the nonprofit and the corporate side. Ashley says, we've heard from many nonprofits that they're concerned about general operating funds moving forward. So what trends are you seeing, and perhaps, if I might add, anticipating from companies to ensure that the funding they're providing now, perhaps, and this is my addition, in a focus area that is not on the front line or tangential to the front line, doesn't jeopardize their regular grant making that nonprofits depend on? Jane, you're on screen, so we'll start with you.
Wow. I think that everyone is going to need general operating support, and it's a game changer, as we've all said, and times are different. And so I think that the notion of business as usual with your nonprofit partners is just out the door.
And then there was light. And then you're shedding light on the situation, literally.
I think, honestly, I'm on so many Zoom calls. He just thinks it's another Zoom call. He doesn't realize that it's on Facebook, and so I apologize, everybody. I got so distracted, honestly.
Okay. We'll come back to you. We'll come back to you for the last word. Melissa, let's go to you next.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at least what I've seen is companies realize, right, that where I may have wanted my funding to be restricted and go to a very specific program that we've loved for years and years, and we have our executives are volunteering or our day-to-day workers are volunteering, we get it. And again, it harkens back to having conversations and letting your corporations know that while that funding was so very vital for that program, we can't have that program if we can't pay for the technology in order to deliver that program. Now we're delivering it virtually. So I think that there's the annual support that sometimes has been restricted, but again, I'm seeing both sides, right? We're seeing that you've got companies that are actually shuttering their foundations, and we've given our last gift, and that's all we're going to be able to do. Use it how you will. And then you have others that are, no, we believe in this particular program. We know you need the support for that. And over and above, we can reach into the coffers or do a drive or do something in order to fund your operational needs. So I think, again, it's genuine, honest conversations on the part of the nonprofits to their corporate partners to be able to say, this is what we need now in order to, yes, deliver our programs, and also to be able to keep the doors open, quite frankly.
Lauren Duggar.
I think there just needs to be a lot of flexibility on the side of corporate partners, and needing to realize that, you know, you might have a multi-year grant that had certain metrics. Those need to be pushed aside. A lot of nonprofits are worried about that. A state organization we work with has been working with the government and their funding, and have gotten regulations and certain restrictions waived very quickly so they can continue on with the important work they're doing. So I think that corporations need to take that in mind, keep that in mind as they're moving forward. And nonprofits need to let people know that that's what they need. If you're receiving a grant that was earmarked for a certain project, call the folks who promised you that money and say, is there any way we could refocus this money to general operating support? It's just, again, having those conversations. But I think right now at this point, the more flexibility that we can bring to the table, the better it is for sustaining our safety net of nonprofits.
Whitney.
I would agree. I have seen that because of the substantial impact of COVID-19, it's completely changed that conversation in the philanthropic and corporate sector, which I think has been needed for a really long time. But now it's out. It's, you know, it's foundations that are saying, if we gave you a grant before, we need to be flexible with that grant because we understand that you may need to use it differently. So that's happening. And then in the corporate side, it's, you know, also that they're looking at how can we be able to sustain the nonprofit community. So those decisions are happening. You know, one of my clients is a corporate foundation, and we just had that conversation, allowing that flexibility in the short term, but then also looking at, you know, how we are giving for a response, but then how can we sustain that moving forward? And I think that's a balancing act that companies and foundations are actively exploring, not only locally in the Dallas-Fort Worth areas, but across the country in the conversations that I've had. So that's happening. It's just, you know, how to balance that. I think we're still figuring it out because, as Jane said, this continues to change and evolve and impact people differently. So we're still grappling with that, but it is something that at least there is the acknowledgement that foundations and corporations have to pay attention to operating expenses now and in the future, because if we are to continue to have nonprofits that are a part of great causes, they have to be able to have those essential funds to continue to have capacity to do their work. So that to me has been a really positive outcome from this pandemic, is being able to, you know, unveil that and for the funding community to talk about that so candidly and allow for the flexibility for that to happen.
Jane Randel, special guest joining us from New York. Let me give you the last word, both on that, either on that question or on anything else, as you'd like to conclude for the day.
Thank you. Sorry about that, everybody. I will say that this has, what I think the situation has uncovered for corporations is the need to show leadership and to help be an additional safety net. Right? There are lots of things the government isn't or can't or won't do that companies have been for years stepping up, and I think you're going to see that even more so. I think also, like everybody said, corporations had to be flexible on a dime, and so they understand what it means to suddenly change your whole business model. And to, you know, there's an organization that one of our clients funds called SMASH, which it's an amazing organization. It serves youth of color around STEM, and there's usually on campus. My client funds a Wharton campus. Well, they're taking the whole thing online this year, right? They're not going to bring these kids to a campus. And so the flexibility to say, okay, we get it. How can we still help you with what you're doing? Because we believe in the issue and we believe in you. So I think that corporations are realizing their role in society, in the world, even more so than they did before. And they're starting in a lot of ways with their employee base and moving out from there.
So that's a great way to end. This was so fun. Thank you all very much. Our panelists did a great job. We'll give you a virtual round of applause. Jane Randel, thank you for joining us from New York and the East Coast. My colleagues, Lauren Duggar, Melissa Cameron, and Whitney Strauss as part of the Sunwest CSR and Philanthropic Services family. Want to share with you quickly again, check out our bios of our panelists at sunwestpr.com, and invite all of you to join us next week. We're going to continue our webinar series focused on looking beyond the crisis, and we're going to talk about crisis communications, featuring 4 panelists from Trademark Property Company, Advocare International, Andrews Distributing, and Geo Global Partners, all of whom have great stories to tell about communicating during the crisis and what they're doing in best practices for communications as many states and businesses reopen. I want to thank you all again. My name is Crayton Webb with Sunwest Communications. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks once again to our fantastic panelists. Hope you all will join us again next week. If you need more details, please again, check us out at sunwestpr.com, on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter. And once again, we hope to see you at noon Central Time for our panel on crisis communications, looking beyond the crisis, next week on Friday, May the 15th. Thanks again, everybody. I hope you have a great afternoon. Stay safe, be kind, and be well. And we'll see you again. Thanks, everybody.